The dangerous men aren't the ones who shout. They're the ones who stay calm when a gun is pointed at the only thing they love. The revolver trembled slightly beside Clara Mercer's cheek as rain slammed against the cabin windows hard enough to sound like gravel thrown by angry ghosts. The robber holding her smelled of wet leather, whiskey, and horse sweat. His breathing came fast, nervous, young. But the man standing across the room from him looked carved from colder things. Elias Mercer rested one hand against the edge of the wooden table beside the stove, silent beneath the weak glow of an oil lantern. He didn't reach for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Didn't plead. Didn't even blink. That was the first thing that made Silas Crow uneasy. "You deaf, old man?" Silas barked, forcing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I said your wife's got about 3 seconds before this cabin gets real sad." Clara swallowed carefully, the barrel cold against her skin. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. But Elias only watched the 3 men standing in his home like he was studying weather rolling over distant hills. Calm. Measuring. "You should leave," he said quietly. The words settled into the room heavier than thunder. One of the robbers laughed too quickly. "Hear that, Silas? Rancher thinks he's giving orders." The younger man shoved Clara forward hard enough to make her stumble against the table. Coffee spilled across the floorboards. The smell of burnt beans mixed with rainwater drifting through cracks in the cabin walls. Still Elias didn't move. Outside, somewhere beyond the black prairie, a horse whinnied nervously against the storm. Clara looked at her husband and felt that same strange chill she had carried for the last 6 years. Not fear of him. Fear of what she still didn't know about him. Because men like Elias Mercer didn't exist anymore. Men who could split oak logs for 10 straight hours without speaking. Men who slept facing the door every night. Men who noticed every sound before it happened. 3 months after they married, Clara once woke near midnight and found Elias standing barefoot on the porch and freezing snow, staring into darkness with a shotgun in his hands. "What are you looking at?" she had whispered. He never answered. Just kept staring at the tree line like he expected the past itself to come riding out of it. Now that same silence filled the cabin again. Silas walked slowly across the room, muddy boots groaning against old wood. His eyes swept over the small ranch house. One lantern, one table, one Bible beside the fireplace. Nothing valuable. "Funny thing is," Silas muttered, "we tracked a man through 3 counties to find this place." That finally made Elias lift his eyes slightly. Tiny movement, barely noticeable, but Clara saw it. So did the oldest robber standing near the hallway door. The older man frowned beneath his gray beard, staring hard at Elias' face, as if some buried memory had started clawing upward. "Boss," he said quietly, "maybe we should just take the horses and go." Silas scoffed. "Afraid of a farmer?" "No," the older man replied slowly, eyes never leaving Elias. "I'm afraid I've seen those eyes before." Lightning flashed beyond the windows, washing the cabin in pale white for half a second. Long enough for the old robber to notice the scar disappearing beneath Elias Mercer's collar. Long enough for all the color to drain from his face. The storm outside suddenly didn't feel like the worst thing surrounding that cabin anymore. The old robber could not stop staring at the scar beneath Elias Mercer's collar. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat onto the floorboards while the lantern flame danced weakly between them. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the old man took one slow step backward. "I knew a man once," he muttered carefully. "Had a scar just like that." Silas Crow rolled his eyes. "You are trembling over an old rancher with gray in his beard." But the older robber was no longer looking at Elias like a rancher. He was looking at him the way men look at abandoned graveyards. Curious from a distance, terrified up close. Clara noticed it immediately. The old man's breathing had changed. His hand hovered near his revolver, but not like he wanted to draw it. Like he wanted comfort. Elias remained beside the table, quiet. Beneath the lantern glow, one hand resting flat against the wood. Outside, wind pushed across the Wyoming plains in long hollow waves. The cabin groaned softly against the storm. Clara remembered the first time she ever saw this house. 6 years earlier. The place had looked forgotten even then. One lonely ranch sitting 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by empty grassland and dead fence posts silvered by age. No neighbors. No cattle hands. No visitors. Just Elias Mercer and silence. Back then she thought loneliness had made him distant. Now she wondered if distance had been the point all along. Silas shoved open another cabinet and cursed under his breath when he found nothing except canned beans and coffee grounds. "We tracked a ghost for this," he snapped. "Somebody lied to us." Elias finally spoke again, voice low and steady. "Who sent you here?" Silas smirked. "Funny thing is, old man, I do not think you are in a position to ask questions." But Elias did not seem embarrassed or frightened. Clara saw something else instead. Calculation. The same expression he wore while repairing fences before winter storms. Quiet focus. Measured patience. The old robber suddenly glanced toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the cabin. His face tightened. "Boss," he whispered again, "we need to leave now." Silas turned sharply. "You got whiskey for brains tonight?" "You ever hear stories from the Dakota trails?" the older man asked softly. "About a lawman who hunted men across state lines?" Silence settled hard into the room. Even the rain seemed farther away now. Silas frowned impatiently. "What lawman?" The old robber swallowed. "They called him the Widowmaker." Clara felt her stomach tighten slightly. The name sounded wrong inside that cabin, like something old and buried should have stayed beneath dirt. Silas laughed once. "That is campfire nonsense." "No," the old man replied. "I saw what was left behind after he came through Fort Collins in '78. His eyes drifted slowly back toward Elias. "People said he could track a rider through snow after 3 days. Said he never missed details. Never forgot a face." Elias said nothing. But Clara noticed something strange then. One tiny thing she had never questioned before. Her husband had never once asked a stranger their name twice. Never forgotten a birthday. Never forgotten a debt. He remembered everything. Silas finally grew irritated enough to step directly toward Elias. "I am getting tired of this story." His muddy boot stopped inches from the table. "You got hidden money somewhere in this house." Elias lifted his eyes slowly toward him, pale gray beneath the lantern light, calm as frozen steel. "No, then why would somebody pay us $2,000 to find you?" That question changed the room. Clara saw it immediately. Not fear, not panic, recognition. Something old passed through Elias Mercer's face for half a second before disappearing again beneath stillness. The old robber noticed too. And when Elias finally looked toward the hallway behind them, the old man followed his gaze and quietly whispered the one sentence that made every man in the cabin suddenly uneasy. "There is something in this house he does not want us seeing." The hallway behind the kitchen looked darker than the rest of the cabin, as if the lantern light itself refused to go near it. Rain rattled across the windows while the old robber stared toward that narrow stretch of shadow with growing unease. Clara could smell wet wool and cold mud drifting from the men's coats, but beneath it now came another scent. Dust. Old wood. Something shut away for years. Silas Crow noticed the tension spreading through his crew and straightened his shoulders like a man refusing to admit fear had entered the room. "Enough ghost stories," he snapped. "Open the door." Nobody moved. Elias Mercer remained beside the table, silent beneath the lantern glow, but Clara saw the smallest change in him. His fingers pressed harder against the wood. Not panic. Warning. The old robber took another careful step back. "Boss," he muttered, "I am telling you something is wrong here." Silas laughed harshly and drew his revolver halfway from its holster. "You know what is wrong? We rode 60 miles through freezing rain chasing rumors about hidden gold, and now my men are trembling because an old rancher has a scar." His voice echoed through the cabin, but nobody joined the laughter this time. Clara's eyes drifted toward her husband. She remembered another winter evening 2 years earlier when a drunk ranch hand in town accidentally bumped into Elias near the general store. The man apologized immediately before Elias even spoke a word. Strange at the time. Stranger now. Because people who had never met Elias often reacted to him like they recognized something dangerous beneath the surface. Back then Clara told herself it was his silence. His sighs. The way he watched rooms without moving his head. But standing inside that storm-beaten cabin tonight, she realized silence alone did not make grown men nervous. History did. Silas finally shoved past the old robber and marched toward the hallway. His boots groaned against the floorboards. The younger outlaw still held Clara near the table, but his grip had weakened. Sweat rolled along his temple despite the cold air. Elias watched Silas approach the hallway without speaking. "What is back there?" Silas demanded. Elias answered calmly. "Memories." The younger robber gave a nervous laugh. That is supposed to scare us? Elias slowly lifted his eyes toward him. It should. Wind howled against the cabin hard enough to shake the windows. Somewhere outside, horses stomped restlessly against the mud. Silas reached the hallway and stopped before a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron strips blackened by age. Unlike everything else in the cabin, the lock looked newer, stronger. Clara felt her chest tighten. In 6 years of marriage, Elias had never once opened that room in front of her. Not once. She used to ask about it sometimes. He always answered the same way. Nothing in there belongs to this life. At the time, she thought he meant old grief. A dead family. A war memory. But now, with 3 armed men standing inside their home and one outlaw slowly turning pale beside the hallway, those words felt heavier. Silas grabbed the iron handle and rattled it once. Locked. Well now, he muttered, glancing back with a crooked grin. Looks like we finally found something worth hiding. The old robber immediately shook his head. Do not open that door. Silas ignored him. Why not? The old man swallowed hard before speaking. Because if this really is who I think it is, then whatever is inside that room is probably the reason he disappeared. Silence settled over the cabin again. Even the storm outside seemed distant now. Clara looked toward Elias slowly. For the first time since the robbers arrived, she saw something dangerous flicker behind his calm expression. Not anger. Regret. Deep enough to drown in. Then Silas pulled a small iron key from his coat pocket and smiled. Funny thing about secrets, he said softly. Somebody always sells them eventually. And for the first time that night, Elias Mercer stepped away from the table. The moment Elias Mercer stepped away from the table, every man in the cabin noticed it. Not because he moved fast, because until then, he had barely moved at all. The lantern light stretched across the wooden floor as he crossed the room slowly, boots heavy against old pine boards polished smooth by years of silence. Rain hammered the roof hard enough to rattle dust from the beams overhead. Clara felt her pulse quicken as Elias stopped halfway between the kitchen and the hallway. Do not open that door, he said quietly. Silas Crow smiled like a man finally hearing weakness in another man's voice. There it is, he muttered. I knew you cared about something in this house. But Clara heard something different beneath Elias' words. Not fear for himself. Fear for everyone else standing there. The older robber heard it too. His eyes never left Elias' face. Boss, he whispered carefully, listen to him. Silas ignored him and slid the iron key into the lock. The metal clicked softly beneath the storm outside. Clara watched Elias closely then. His hands remained steady at his sides, but his eyes drifted briefly toward the window over Clara's shoulder, measuring distance, measuring exits, the same way he did every time they entered town together, the same way he always sat facing doors in crowded places. Tiny habits Clara had ignored for years now lined up inside her mind like fence posts finally forming a road. Silas twisted the key. The old lock groaned. A cold draft slipped from beneath the door, carrying the scent of old paper, machine oil, and cedar wood sealed too long from sunlight. Nobody spoke. Even the younger robber holding Clara seemed frozen now, his revolver lowered slightly without him realizing it. Silas pulled the door open 3 inches. Then 6. Darkness waited inside. The lantern glow barely reached beyond the doorway. For a second, nothing looked unusual. Just shadows. Dust. Shapes hidden beneath canvas covers. Then lightning flashed outside. White light spilled briefly into the hallway. And Clara saw them. Rifles lined perfectly across the walls. Army issue. Cleaned. Maintained. Beside them hung old leather gun belts worn smooth with age. A faded map covered one side of the room, filled with hand-drawn marks stretching across Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, and the Dakota Territory. But it was the papers pinned beside the map that changed the room completely. Wanted posters. Dozens of them. Some old enough to yellow at the edges. Clara's breath caught softly in her throat as Silas stepped closer to the wall and lifted the lantern higher. Every poster carried the same face. Younger. Harder. But unmistakable. Elias Mercer. Only the name beneath the sketches was different. Ezekiel Vale. Reward for capture. Dead or alive. The younger robber immediately stepped backward away from Clara. No, he muttered. No damn way. The old robber closed his eyes briefly, like a man finally realizing a nightmare was real. Silas stared at the posters without speaking. Then his smile slowly faded. "You were a lawman?" he asked. Elias remained still behind him. "Something like that." Clara looked toward her husband, but suddenly the man she married felt farther away than the mountains beyond the storm. She remembered all the nights Elias woke before sunrise to walk the property alone. All the scars he never explained. All the letters that arrived with no return address before quietly disappearing into the fireplace by morning. She had married a rancher. But standing in that cabin now, surrounded by the ghosts hanging on those walls, she realized she never truly knew the man at all. Silas slowly removed one poster from the wall and studied the younger face staring back at him. $20,000, he whispered. That was a fortune 15 years ago. The old robber finally found his voice again. There were stories after the railroad massacres. Men said Vale hunted gangs for governors, marshals, even army officers. His throat tightened. People used to say if he came after your crew, you disappeared before sunrise. Silence settled heavily through the cabin. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains like distant cannon fire. Then Silas looked over his shoulder toward Elias Mercer and asked the question nobody else in that room wanted answered. If you buried this life years ago, why are men still paying to find you? Thunder rolled across the Wyoming plains while the lantern flame trembled in Silas Crow's hand. The wanted poster crackled softly between his fingers as he stared at the younger version of Elias Mercer nailed to the wall beside dozens of other ghosts. $20,000. The number hung inside the room heavier than smoke. Clara watched rain slide down the cabin windows in thin silver lines while silence settled over everyone. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody moved carelessly anymore either. Even the younger robber near the kitchen doorway had lowered his revolver completely now, eyes fixed on the wall of old posters like he had stumbled into a church built for dangerous men. Silas slowly turned toward Elias. You hunted gangs for money? He asked quietly. Elias stood near the center of the room, shoulders still, face unreadable beneath the lantern glow. At first, the old robber swallowed hard. Boss, we need to ride out now. Silas ignored him again, though his confidence no longer sounded real. Funny thing is, he muttered, I spent half my life hearing stories about Ezekiel Vale. He lifted another poster from the wall. Men said he tracked killers through blizzards. Said he walked into outlaw camps alone. His eyes narrowed toward Elias. But stories always leave something out. Elias remained silent. Clara noticed he had not looked directly at the posters once since the door opened. Like a man refusing to stare at graves, he buried himself. Wind screamed against the cabin hard enough to shake the roof beams overhead. Somewhere outside, one of the horses kicked nervously against the mud. Silas stepped farther into the hidden room, lantern raised higher now. More details emerged from the darkness. Leather journals stacked neatly on shelves. Maps covered in handwritten notes. Small metal badges hanging from hooks beside old ammunition belts. But one object near the back wall caught Clara's attention more than anything else. A wooden chair facing the far corner. Alone beneath a dusty blanket folded with military precision. The sight sent a strange chill through her chest. It looked less like furniture and more like punishment. Silas noticed it too. What is the chair for? He asked. Elias answered without hesitation. Thinking. The younger robber gave a nervous laugh that quickly faded when nobody joined him. The old outlaw near the hallway looked ready to leave the cabin entirely now. Sweat glistened beneath his gray beard despite the cold air. I knew a deputy once, he whispered. Man said Vale never drank whiskey after jobs. His eyes drifted slowly toward the wooden chair. Said he would sit alone afterward for hours without speaking. Clara looked at Elias again, but the man standing before her suddenly felt split in two. One half was the rancher who fixed fences at sunrise and carried flour sacks inside before storms arrived. The other half belonged to those walls. Those posters. That chair. Silas carefully opened one of the old journals resting near the map table. The pages were filled with names, dates, and locations written in sharp, clean handwriting. Every line looked organized, measured, methodical. Then Silas stopped turning pages. His smile disappeared completely. What is it? The younger robber asked quietly. Silas did not answer right away. Clara saw his eyes moving slowly across one particular page. Finally, he lifted the journal higher toward the lantern light. For names had been written there recently. Fresh ink. Not faded like the others. Silas Crow. Owen Pike, Martin Hale, Clyde Rooker, every outlaw currently standing inside the cabin. A cold silence swallowed the room. The younger Robert took 2 shaky steps backward. "No," he whispered. "No damn way." The old robber looked like all the air had left his lungs. "Boss," he muttered carefully. "Those are our names." Silas slowly lifted his eyes toward Elias Mercer. "Why are we in your book?" Elias finally looked directly at him then. Calm gray eyes beneath years of silence. "Because," he said softly, "I knew eventually somebody would come." Lightning flashed outside again, turning the hidden room white for half a heartbeat. And for the first time since entering the cabin, Silas Crow looked less like a hunter and more like a man who had walked willingly into somebody else's trap. Rainwater slid down the cabin windows while nobody inside the hidden room seemed willing to breathe too loudly anymore. The lantern in Silas Crow's hand flickered weakly against the walls covered in old wanted posters and maps, stained by years of dust and cigarette smoke. Clara stood near the kitchen table, watching the 4 names written inside Elias Mercer's journal settle into the room like a death sentence nobody understood yet. Silas Crow, Owen Pike, Martin Hale, Clyde Rooker. Every man standing inside the cabin had been expected. The younger outlaw swallowed hard and backed another step toward the front door. "You knew we were coming?" he whispered. Elias remained still near the hallway entrance, broad shoulders half hidden beneath shadow. "I knew somebody would." Thunder rolled low across the prairie outside. The old robber rubbed one hand across his beard nervously while staring at the journals lining the shelves. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long you been waiting?" Elias looked toward the hidden room without emotion. "Long enough." Clara noticed something strange then. None of the journals looked abandoned. No dust covered the most recent one. The ink on the names still looked dark and fresh beneath the lantern light. Her husband had not buried this life completely. He had only hidden it beneath silence. Silas finally forced out a dry laugh, though it sounded thinner than before. "You expect me to believe an old rancher sat out here for years waiting on ghosts?" Elias answered calmly. "Men like you are not ghosts." The old outlaw near the hallway suddenly muttered under his breath. "No, we are prey." Silence followed immediately after the words left his mouth. Even he looked surprised he had spoken them aloud. Clara saw Silas glance toward his men, then back toward Elias again, trying to pull control back into his hands. But fear had already entered the room. Quiet fear. The dangerous kind. The younger robber finally lowered his revolver completely. "Boss," he whispered, "we should ride." Silas turned sharply toward him. "Ride where?" Nobody answered, because outside the storm had grown worse. Wind screamed across the plains hard enough to rattle the stable doors nearby. Mud swallowed the yard beyond the cabin. 30 miles of empty Wyoming darkness stretched in every direction. Clara suddenly realized how isolated they truly were. No sheriff, no nearby ranchers, no witnesses, just rain, prairie, and the man she married standing quietly beside a room full of his past. Silas slowly closed the journal in his hand. "Somebody paid good money to send us here," he muttered. "That means somebody still fears you." Elias said nothing, but Clara saw his jaw tighten slightly for the first time all night. Tiny movement, barely noticeable, yet it changed something inside the room immediately. The old robber noticed it too. "Boss," he said carefully, "there is more to this than robbery." Silas stepped closer toward Elias now, though the confidence in his stride looked forced. "Who hired us matters less than what you did to deserve it." Elias met his eyes evenly. "That depends who tells the story." Clara remembered another strange moment from years earlier. A traveling preacher once stopped by the ranch during summer drought season. The old man sat across from Elias at dinner and asked where he learned to shoot so well after noticing the rifle targets behind the barn. Elias answered politely enough. "Army taught me." But the preacher studied him for a long moment afterward before quietly saying, "No, we're taught you." Clara never forgot the look that passed between them afterward. Recognition. The same look now filling this cabin. Silas slowly drew one finger across the edge of the wanted poster in his hand. $20,000 was enough money to make men betray each other back then. He looked up toward Elias carefully. "So who survived long enough to still hate you after all these years?" For the first time that night, Elias Mercer did not answer immediately. Rain hammered the roof. Wind howled through cracks in the walls. Somewhere outside, one of the horses screamed suddenly into the darkness. Then Elias finally lifted his eyes toward the storm beyond the window and spoke so quietly Clara almost missed it. The only men who survive that long are the ones you failed to kill. The horse outside screamed again. Sharp. Panicked. Then silence swallowed the prairie once more. Inside the cabin, nobody moved for several long seconds after Elias Mercer spoke about the men he failed to kill. Rain hammered the roof in slow, heavy waves while the lantern flame shook softly against the hidden room walls. Clara could feel the tension changing shape now. Earlier, the robbers acted like wolves circling a lonely ranch house. But wolves only stay brave until they realize something larger is already hunting nearby. Silas Crow tried to hide it better than the others. He folded the wanted poster carefully and shoved it into his coat pocket before stepping closer toward Elias again. You expect me to believe somebody powerful enough to remember Ezekiel Vale waited 15 years just to send 4 men after you? Elias looked toward the storm-dark window. No, then what? Elias finally met his eyes again. More are coming. The younger outlaw near the kitchen swallowed hard enough Clara heard it across the room. Owen Pike, barely older than 20. Mud still clung to the bottom of his boots from the ride through the plains. Earlier he looked eager. Dangerous in the reckless way young men often are when they still believe fear belongs to somebody else. Now he looked trapped. Boss, Owen muttered carefully. We should leave while we still can. Silas turned sharply toward him. Ride where? Nobody answered because everybody understood the truth already. Storm this heavy could swallow trails by morning. Rivers would rise. Mud would cripple. Horses. And if Elias Mercer was telling the truth, then somewhere beyond that rain other riders might already be moving toward the cabin. Clara watched her husband quietly. He had not raised his voice once all night, had not threatened anyone. Yet every sentence from him seemed to make the room smaller, colder. The old robber, Martin Hale, slowly removed his hat and wiped rainwater from his forehead. I heard stories after Cheyenne, he said softly. A whole crew vanished near Black Hollow Canyon. His eyes stayed fixed on Elias. People blamed outlaws, but survivors said one man tracked them for 6 days through snow. Clara saw something flicker briefly behind Elias' expression then. Memory, not pride. Never pride. Regret. Stories get bigger over time, Elias replied quietly. Martin shook his head. Not that one. Wind shoved hard against the cabin walls again. The front shutters rattled violently before settling back into place. Clara noticed Elias glance toward the windows automatically, measuring the storm without even thinking about it. Every movement from him carried old habits sharpened by years nobody in that room fully understood. Silas walked deeper into the hidden room and studied the map pinned across the far wall. Thin black lines stretched through mountain passes, abandoned mining towns, rail routes, and old military trails. Some marks looked recent. You kept tracking routes all these years? He asked. Elias answered calmly. Some roads never stop being dangerous. Silas ran one finger across the map slowly until he stopped near a small circle marked in dark ink less than 50 miles from the ranch. Beside it sat one word. Redstone. The moment Silas saw it, something changed in his face. Tiny. Fast. But Clara noticed. So did Elias. Silence followed immediately. Elias stepped forward one pace. You know that town. It was not a question. Silas looked away from the map. Everybody knows Redstone. But the lie arrived too quickly. Martin Hale noticed it too. Boss, he whispered carefully. Who hired us? Silas ignored him. Rain crashed harder against the roof now, almost drowning the room in noise. Clara watched Elias carefully. For the first time. All night, his eyes narrowed slightly. Not from fear. Recognition. Like two men circling the same hidden truth without speaking it aloud. Then a sudden sound drifted faintly through the storm outside. Hoofbeats. Far away. Slow. More than one horse. Owen Pike froze instantly. Martin Hale's face lost what little color remained. And Elias Mercer turned toward the front door with the calm expression of a man who had been expecting company all along. The hoofbeats outside grew louder beneath the storm. Slow. Steady. More than one rider crossing soaked Wyoming earth toward the lonely ranch house. Every man inside the cabin heard them now. Nobody spoke. The lantern flame trembled weakly while rain slammed against the windows hard enough to blur the world beyond the glass into shifting gray shadows. Owen Pike stepped away from the kitchen table, breathing fast. How many riders? He whispered. Elias Mercer stood near the center of the room, eyes fixed toward the front door. Enough. The answer settled heavily inside the cabin. Martin Hale immediately moved toward the window beside the stove and carefully lifted the curtain edge 1 inch. Lightning flashed across the plains. For half a heartbeat, dark figures appeared through the rain. Horsemen, wide-brimmed hats, long coats. Then darkness swallowed them again. Martin let the curtain fall instantly. 3, he muttered. Maybe 4. Silas Crow cursed under his breath and finally drew his revolver fully from its holster. But Clara noticed something important then. He was not pointing it at Elias anymore. He was staring toward the storm outside like a man trying to decide which danger frightened him most. The hidden room behind them suddenly felt smaller, warmer, full of ghosts pressing closer with every second. Clara looked at Elias carefully. You knew they would come tonight? She asked softly. For the first time since the robbers arrived, Elias looked directly at her. His expression changed slightly then, softer around the eyes. Tired. I hoped I was wrong. The honesty in his voice frightened Clara more than anything else had so far. Another flash of lightning rolled across the prairie. This time the riders were closer. She could make out long rifles strapped across saddles and dark coats soaked by rain. They moved calmly through the storm without hurry, like men who already knew where they were headed. Owen Pike shook his head nervously. Who are they? Elias answered quietly. Men I should have finished burying years ago. Silas turned sharply toward him. You keep talking in riddles. Elias looked back toward the storm. Because plain truth sounds worse. The front porch creaked suddenly beneath heavy boots outside. Everyone froze. Clara could hear rain dripping from the roof gutters and horses snorting softly beyond the cabin walls. Then came 3 slow knocks against the front door. Not loud, not rushed, calm enough to chill the blood. Nobody inside moved. Another knock echoed through the cabin. Martin Hale stepped backward away from the window. I know that knock, he whispered faintly. Silas glanced toward him. What? Martin swallowed hard. Black Hollow Canyon. 15 years ago. His voice trembled slightly now. Survivors said the men hunting them always knocked first. Clara saw Elias close his eyes briefly at those words. Not from fear. From memory. Then a voice drifted through the storm outside. Deep. Older. Ezekiel. Silence swallowed the room completely. Even the storm felt distant for one strange second. The voice outside spoke again. You have been difficult to find. Silas Crow slowly looked toward Elias Mercer. You know him? Elias opened his eyes again. Calm gray beneath the lantern glow. Unfortunately. Another long pause followed. Then the voice outside continued softly, almost politely. We only want the journal. Elias did not answer. Clara noticed his hand finally move for the first time toward the old rifle mounted above the fireplace. Not quickly, not dramatically, just deliberate, like a man reaching for something familiar after many years apart. Outside, boots shifted across the wooden porch. You should know. The voice continued through the rain. The governor in Redstone doubled the price on your head after Denver. Owen Pike stared toward Elias in disbelief. Governor, he whispered. What in God's name did you do? Elias lifted the rifle carefully from the wall and checked the chamber without emotion. The metallic click echoed softly through the cabin. Then he looked toward the frightened outlaw and answered with a calmness that made the room colder than the storm outside. I told the truth about the wrong men. Rain rolled down the cabin windows in crooked silver lines while the voice outside disappeared back into the storm. Nobody inside the house moved. The silence after those words felt heavier than thunder. Clara stood near the kitchen table watching Elias Mercer hold the old rifle with the familiarity of a man touching part of himself he spent years trying to bury. The lantern light caught the edges of the weapon, revealing scratches worn smooth by age and weather. Not decoration. Use. Long use. Owen Pike looked pale now, barely able to keep his eyes steady. Governor, he whispered again. You crossed governors? Elias checked the rifle chamber once more before answering. I crossed men pretending to be governors. Another slow creak drifted across the porch outside. Calm footsteps. No rushing. No shouting. Whoever waited beyond that door carried patience dangerous enough to fill the entire cabin. Silas Crow slowly lowered his revolver toward the floor. Not surrender. Calculation. You said they want the journal, he muttered. What is inside it? Elias looked toward the hidden room. Names. Martin Hale immediately stiffened beside the window. Names of who? Elias met his eyes calmly. Men who sold towns to rail companies. Judges who buried witnesses. Deputies who helped burn families off land they wanted cheap. The room fell silent again. Clara felt cold move slowly through her chest. She remembered small things now. Tiny moments that once seemed harmless. Elias refusing railroad work no matter how desperate winter became. Elias turning away traveling lawmen at the gate without explanation. Elias burning newspapers after reading certain names. The puzzle pieces finally began fitting together, and what they formed frightened her more than the storm outside. Silas studied Elias carefully. You kept records. Somebody had to. And that made powerful enemies. Elias gave a faint nod. Powerful men survive by making truth disappear. Wind slammed hard against the cabin walls again. Outside, horses shifted through mud while rainwater poured from the roof edges in heavy streams. Then the older voice beyond the door returned once more. You still hide behind silence, Ezekiel. Clara watched Elias carefully when he heard the old name again. Not anger. Weariness. Like a man hearing chains dragged across old memories. Who is that? She asked softly. Elias remained still for several seconds before answering. Jonah Ritter. Martin Hale immediately looked down at the floor. Sweet God, he whispered. Silas glanced sharply toward him. You know him? Martin nodded slowly. Everybody in Kansas knew Jonah Ritter 15 years ago. His voice lowered carefully. He used to hunt fugitives for railroad money. Clara noticed Elias tighten one hand slightly around the rifle stock. He hunted anything people paid him to hunt, Elias corrected quietly. Owen Pike swallowed hard. And now he is hunting you. No, Elias replied softly. Now he is cleaning up loose ends. Lightning flashed outside the windows again. For half a second, Clara saw the outline of riders standing motionless beyond the porch through the storm, watching the cabin, waiting. Patient men frightened her more than angry ones ever could. Silas stepped closer toward Elias, his confidence thinner now, but not gone completely. If this Jonah wants the journal so badly, why not burn it? Elias looked toward him calmly. Because once truth disappears, men like him win forever. The words settled deep inside the cabin. Clara suddenly understood something important then. Elias Mercer had not hidden at this ranch because he feared dying. He had hidden because he was tired. Tired of chasing evil across endless territory while richer men bought new names and clean suits. Tired of burying friends while corrupt officials shook hands in polished offices. Tired of carrying memories heavy enough to poison every quiet moment afterward. Another knock came at the front door. Slower this time. More personal somehow. Then Jonah Ritter's voice drifted softly through the storm again. You know how this ends. Elias stared toward the door without blinking. That is the problem, he answered quietly. I do. Clara looked at her husband carefully then. The rancher she married still stood there beneath the lantern glow. But behind his eyes now lived another man entirely. Older than his years. Sharper than the rifle in his hands. A man who had spent too long learning exactly what powerful people were willing to do when the truth finally cornered them. The storm outside seemed alive now. Wind dragged across the plains in long hollow cries, while rain hammered the cabin roof without mercy. Inside, the lantern glow had grown weaker, throwing long shadows across the walls covered in old maps and forgotten names. Nobody inside the ranch house trusted silence anymore. Not after hearing Jonah Ritter's voice through that door. Clara stood near the kitchen table watching Elias Mercer carefully. He held the rifle low beside his leg, calm as ever, but something inside him had changed since the riders arrived. The rancher she knew still existed somewhere beneath that weathered face and quiet voice. But tonight another man had stepped forward. A man built from years nobody talked about anymore. How many men does Ritter have? Silas Crow asked quietly. Elias listened to the wind for a second before answering. Enough to burn this place down if they lose patience. Owen Pike cursed under his breath. Martin Hale removed his hat completely now, fingers trembling slightly as he rubbed the brim. I told you we should have ridden away, he muttered. Silas snapped toward him. Ride into what? A flooded prairie and armed riders behind us. Nobody answered because the truth sat too heavy in the room already. They were trapped. Not by walls. By timing. Clara noticed Elias glance toward the back of the cabin, then toward the hidden room again, his eyes measuring distance, and exits the way other men counted prayers. There is another way out, she whispered suddenly. Elias looked at her. Not anymore. The answer chilled her more than the storm. Outside, boots shifted slowly across the porch. Calm movements. Controlled. Jonah Ritter and his men were not nervous. That frightened Clara deeply. Nervous men made mistakes. Calm men made plans. Then Ritter's voice drifted through the rain once more. I know you are reading the room, Ezekiel. Silence followed. You always did think 3 steps ahead. Elias said nothing. The old hunter outside continued softly. But age changes men. Elias finally spoke toward the front door. Not enough. A faint chuckle came through the storm. Still proud. Still alive, Elias answered. Clara noticed Martin Hale slowly step away from the windows, as though even hearing those 2 men speak felt dangerous. Silas looked toward Elias carefully now, less like an outlaw staring at prey, and more like a gambler realizing he sat at the wrong poker table. You hunted together once, he asked. Elias kept his eyes toward the door. A long time ago. Then what happened? The lantern flame flickered hard as wind rattled the cabin walls again. Elias took several seconds before answering. He started working for men who bought justice instead of earning it. Outside, silence followed those words. Then Jonah Ritter's voice came lower than before. Tell them the truth. Elias stared ahead. They do not need it. No, Ritter replied softly. But your wife does. Clara felt the room tighten instantly. Every eye drifted toward her. Rainwater tapped against the windows in uneven rhythms while the storm rolled endlessly across the prairie outside. Elias slowly turned toward Clara then, and for the first time all night, she saw something close to sorrow behind his gray eyes. 15 years ago, Jonah called through the storm. Your husband uncovered railroad ledgers proving governors and judges ordered settlers removed from valuable land. Clara's breath caught softly. Ritter continued. Families disappeared. Witnesses vanished. Towns burned. Silas Crow stared at Elias in disbelief. And you kept records of it all? Elias answered quietly. Somebody had to remember. Jonah's voice sharpened slightly beyond the door. You were supposed to hand those ledgers over. Elias remained motionless. I was supposed to help bury them. Thunder cracked across the plains hard enough to shake the cabin windows. Clara looked at her husband differently. Now, not as a killer, not even as a lawman, but as a man who learned too late that truth alone could not stop powerful people willing to buy entire governments. Outside, horses shifted impatiently in the mud. Then Jonah Ritter spoke one final sentence through the rain that made the cabin feel colder than winter itself. You should have burned the journal when Clara still believed you were just a rancher. The cabin felt smaller after Jonah Ritter spoke Clara's name. Rain hammered the roof without mercy while cold wind hissed through cracks in the old walls, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant sagebrush. Nobody inside the room looked at each other the same way anymore. Not Silas Crow, not Martin Hale, not even Clara herself. The truth hanging between them had changed the shape of everything. Elias Mercer stood near the fireplace holding the rifle low against his side, calm beneath the fading lantern glow, but Clara saw the exhaustion in him now. Deep, old, like a man who spent years carrying stones nobody else could see. Outside, horses shifted across the muddy yard, while Jonah Ritter waited beneath the storm with impossible patience. You should have left years ago, Ritter called through the rain. But you stayed. Elias stared toward the front door. So did you. A long silence followed. Clara noticed Silas slowly backing away from the hidden room now, eyes moving constantly between Elias, the windows, and the front entrance. The outlaw looked less interested in reward money by the second. This journal, he muttered carefully, if governors are truly named inside it. They are, Elias interrupted quietly. Martin Hale lowered his eyes immediately. Then why keep it? Elias finally looked toward Clara again before answering. Because one day somebody honest might still need proof. The words settled hard inside the cabin. Clara remembered something Elias once told her during their first winter together after she asked why he hated railroad men so much. They had been sitting beside this same fireplace while snow covered the plains outside. Elias stared into the flames for a long time before quietly saying, Powerful men do not steal land with guns. Anymore. They steal it with signatures. At the time, she barely understood what he meant. Tonight, she finally did. Outside, Jonah Ritter laughed softly beneath the rain. Not cruel laughter. Tired laughter. You still think truth matters, he called out. Elias answered immediately. It matters to the families buried because men like you sold them. Silence followed again. Then Ritter's voice lowered. You always blame the wrong people. Clara noticed Elias' jaw tighten slightly. The first crack in his calm all night. I blame the men who profited. No, Ritter replied through the storm. You blame the men who survived. Wind slammed hard against the cabin walls. The lantern flickered violently before settling back into weak yellow light. Owen Pike looked terrified now, fingers twitching near his revolver without drawing it. Boss, he whispered toward Silas. We are caught between ghosts. Silas did not answer. He looked toward Elias carefully instead. What happened in Denver? The question lingered heavily inside the room. Clara saw Elias close his eyes briefly before opening them again. A courthouse burned. Martin Hale looked sick suddenly. Sweet God, Elias continued quietly. 3 witnesses were inside. Clara felt cold rise through her chest. You tried to stop it. Elias stared toward the storm outside. I failed. Jonah Ritter's voice drifted through the rain once more. You could not stop it because the order came from men richer than governors. Another long silence. Then Ritter added softly. You should have taken the money when I offered it. Elias almost smiled then. Bitter. Small. That was the moment you stopped being human. Outside, lightning split the prairie sky bright enough to turn the cabin windows white. For half a second Clara saw Jonah Ritter standing near the porch through the rain. Older now. Gray beneath the hat brim. Long coat dripping water into the mud. But even from that distance, she could feel something dangerous in the stillness of him. Not rage. Certainty. The certainty of a man who spent too many years doing terrible things for powerful people and no longer knew how to stop. Then Ritter spoke one final sentence through. The storm that made every person inside the cabin fall silent again. They are not coming for the journal anymore, Ezekiel. Elias slowly lifted his eyes toward the door. I know. Rain poured harder outside as Ritter's voice lowered almost to a whisper. They are coming because your wife is the only witness left who still believes there was once a good man inside you. Rain crashed against the cabin roof so hard it sounded like handfuls of nails thrown from the sky. Inside, nobody spoke after Jonah Ritter mentioned Clara. The silence hanging through the room felt raw now. Personal. Clara stood frozen near the kitchen table, staring at Elias Mercer while shadows from the dying lantern stretched across the floor between them. She had spent 6 years believing her husband carried sadness. Tonight she realized he carried something far heavier than sadness. Guilt. Elias lowered the rifle slowly beside his leg, eyes fixed toward the front door where Jonah waited beyond the storm. Leave her out of this, he said quietly. It was the first time all night his voice carried anything close to emotion. Outside, Ritter answered almost immediately. You already brought her into it when you kept the journal. Wind pushed hard against the cabin walls. Somewhere outside, a loose chain clanged softly against the stable fence in uneven rhythm with the storm. Owen Pike looked ready to bolt through the back wall, if given the chance. Martin Hale sat heavily near the stove now, face pale beneath his beard, staring at nothing. Even Silas Crow had stopped pretending control belonged to him anymore. Clara watched Elias carefully. The calm man she knew still existed in pieces. In the way he kept standing between danger and everyone else. In the way his voice never rose. But now she also saw the exhaustion beneath it all. Years of looking over his shoulder. Years of waiting for the past to ride out of the darkness. What does he mean? Clara asked softly. Elias remained silent. Outside, Ritter answered for him. Your husband testified against railroad investors, judges, and deputies after Denver. Rainwater poured from the roof outside in silver streams. But before the hearings could begin, the courthouse burned. Clara remembered that part already. The missing witnesses. The dead families. Elias slowly closed his eyes for one long second. Ritter continued. After the fire, powerful men wanted every record erased. Every witness buried. Silas glanced toward the hidden room. Including the journal. Especially the journal, Ritter replied. Clara looked toward Elias again. You kept proof all these years? Elias opened his eyes. I kept names. Why not give them to newspapers? Clara asked. Elias looked tired suddenly. Older than the storm outside. Because newspapers get bought. Silence followed. Bitter silence. Martin Hale gave a faint nod like a man hearing truth he already knew too well. Then Ritter's voice lowered beyond the door. You should tell her the rest. Elias tightened one hand around the rifle stock. No, she deserves truth. Elias stared at the door. Truth is what destroyed everything. The words settled heavily through the cabin. Clara stepped closer toward him slowly. Elias, for the first time that night, he looked directly at her without walls behind his eyes. The night before the Denver hearing, he said quietly, I trusted the wrong man. Rain hammered the roof harder. Nobody moved. I told Jonah where the witnesses were hiding. Clara felt the cold deepen inside her chest. Outside, Ritter laughed softly through the storm. Not proudly, regretfully. You still blame yourself after all these years. Elias ignored him. 3 families disappeared by morning. He continued quietly toward Clara. Children too. His voice never broke. Somehow that made it worse. I spent years hunting the men responsible. Silas Crow frowned slightly. But you never found them. Elias finally looked toward the hidden room, full of journals and maps. I found enough. Clara understood then why the ranch sat so far from town. Why Elias never trusted rail companies. Why he woke at every strange sound in the night. He had not been hiding from punishment. He had been hiding from memory. Outside, boots shifted across the porch again. Then Jonah Ritter spoke through the storm one final time. The riders coming tonight are not railroad men. Anymore. Elias slowly lifted his eyes toward the door. I know who they work for now. Lightning flashed across the prairie bright enough to turn the windows white. And in that brief burst of light, Clara saw something she had not noticed before. Fear. Not in Elias Mercer. In Jonah Ritter standing outside. The storm had begun to weaken by the time dawn threatened the edge of the Wyoming plains. Rain still fell across the ranch in cold silver sheets, but the thunder had drifted farther into the mountains now, leaving behind only wind and silence. Inside the cabin, nobody moved after Clara saw fear in Jonah Ritter's face. It lasted only a second beneath the lightning flash outside, but it changed everything. Men like Jonah Ritter did not fear ordinary things. Elias Mercer noticed it too. He lowered the rifle slightly while staring toward the front door. Who are they working for now? Clara asked quietly. Elias answered without taking his eyes from the storm. Men richer than railroad owners. Silas Crow frowned. There are not many richer than railroad owners. Elias almost smiled. Tired. Bitter. There are always men richer than the last monsters. Outside, horse hooves shifted uneasily through the mud. Jonah Ritter remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking again through the rain. You should leave, Ezekiel. The words surprised everyone inside the cabin. Even Martin Hale slowly lifted his head. Elias narrowed his eyes slightly. That does not sound like you. Ritter gave a low laugh outside. Age changes men. Not enough, Elias answered softly. Another long silence drifted between them. Then Ritter's voice lowered almost to a whisper beneath the storm. They killed Governor Bell 3 weeks ago. The room froze. Silas Crow stared toward the door. Governor Bell? Elias' expression darkened immediately. Clara saw real alarm reach his eyes for the first time all night. He was supposed to testify, Elias muttered quietly. Ritter answered through the rain. He changed his mind. Nobody inside spoke. The lantern flame flickered weakly beside the hidden room walls covered in old maps and forgotten names. Clara suddenly understood the terrible truth hanging over everything. The men behind this were no longer hiding corruption. They were erasing history itself. One witness at a time. One record at a time. One memory at a time. Elias slowly looked toward the journal resting inside the hidden room. Years of names. Years of proof. Years of guilt and unfinished justice bound together beneath worn leather covers. They will never stop hunting it, Clara whispered. Elias nodded once. No. Then something unexpected happened. Silas Crow slowly removed the revolver from his hand and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. The sound echoed softly through the cabin. Owen Pike stared at him in disbelief. Boss. Silas looked toward Elias quietly. The men who hired us never mentioned dead governors. Martin Hale gave a faint, humorless laugh. That is because men like us are tools, son. Outside, Jonah Ritter spoke again. There is still time. Elias stared toward the door. For what? Rain tapped softly against the windows now, gentler than before. To disappear before sunrise. Clara watched her husband carefully. She already knew his answer before he spoke. I spent 15 years disappearing. Silence followed. Elias slowly walked into the hidden room then. boots creaking softly against old floorboards. Clara watched him stop beside the shelves of journals and faded wanted posters. He looked older there somehow, like the walls themselves remembered every version of him he tried to bury. Then Elias reached for the newest journal and carried it back into the main room. Without speaking, he placed it into Clara's hands. The leather felt heavy, warm from years of being held. Clara looked up at him slowly. "Why me?" Elias' eyes softened faintly beneath the lantern light. "Because you still believe truth matters even after learning what it costs." Outside, Jonah Ritter stepped onto the porch. His shadow crossed beneath the front door. "They are close now," he warned quietly. Far off across the plains, new hoofbeats echoed faintly through the dying storm. More riders. Many more this time. Silas Crow moved toward the window carefully, while Owen Pike backed toward the wall in panic. But Elias Mercer only stood beside Clara in silence. Calm again. The same terrible calm from the beginning of the night. Then he reached for his old hat hanging beside the door and settled it onto his head slowly, like a man finally accepting the shape of his past. "Elias," Clara whispered. He looked at her one last time, tired gray eyes carrying more sorrow than fear. Then he spoke the quiet sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. "Out here, the truth does not survive because good men fight for it." Wind hissed softly through the cracks in the cabin walls as dawn crept slowly across the prairie. Elias opened the front door toward the waiting storm and the riders beyond it. "It survives," he said quietly, "because somebody refuses to bury it."